afternoon and welcome to this concert, which we call Dear Composers. The concert happened a few years ago with Jean Townsend and with her husband and myself that came up with that concept. And it's a unique concept which I like to continue. And I welcome the audience, I welcome the presenters and the families of the composers. Can't wait to hear what they have to say about the composers and their music. So today our executive executive director could not be here today. Therefore, one of our board members, our treasurer, Mr. Robert Rainier, took over that job, and you see him outside in his red sweater, and say hi to him. He did a great job. Things are moving smoothly. So then, today, I'm just going to greet you, and then I'm going to leave the show to Jean. So, welcome Jean. Come on stage. This is surprise program. All right, Jean.
I saw her.
Come on out. Lead the audience.
Is it one?
Yes.
So I'll have to watch the video to see what he said. I didn't hear it. Okay. The most I'm prepared to say about my birthday is I was born during World War II, and I'm almost an octogenarian. But Meredith has me beat. Now this is the concert where we feature 5 dearly departed, very accomplished. This is a concert where we feature 5 dearly departed, very accomplished 20th century American composers, and where we then invite their close relatives, like widows and children, or other intimates to come and speak to us about them from a very personal perspective. And it's a lot of fun. And we get an insight into the lives of these composers that perhaps we didn't have before. Today we are presenting the music of 5 exceedingly gifted composers, all of whom were acknowledged as such by their peers in their lifetime. 2 of them share the distinction of being truly authentic Manhattanites. William Mayer and Douglas Townsend were born, raised, lived, and died right here on our home turf of New York City. Or shall we say right here on the Manhattan schist of New York City. The other 3 composers are all African Americans, but they were born out of state. They were born in Arizona, Ohio, and Delaware, but they migrated when they were young to New York City in furtherance of their careers. They all stayed here and worked here, and they held notable places in the musical community here. 2 of them, Dorothy Rudmore and Kermit Moore, married shortly after Dorothy arrived here, and they stayed here in Manhattan, devoted to each other and to music until they each passed here within the last decade. Now the third of that group of African American composers, who was originally from out of state, was Ulysses Kay. And we have 2 of his composition students and advocates here today to speak about him because his daughter, Virginia Kay, was unable to do so. And she lives in New Jersey, but she did want me to pass along her warm greetings to everyone And it was she who requested that we play the early work of her father, this early work for oboe and piano, which we are doing today. So let's start the program off with Ulysses Kay, the oldest composer in this group. He was born during World War I in 1917, and that's 1 year before Leonard Bernstein, just for context. And it's 17 years after Aaron Copland was born. So it's easy to remember Aaron Copland because he was born in 1900. And it's a good gauge of everyone else. Our first speaker up will be familiar to many of you. He is our Vice President, Brian Hunter. Brian was a student of Ulysses Kay when Kay was a professor teaching in the music department of Lehman College. Please welcome Brian Hunter to the stage.
Yeah.
Ulysses Kay was a master musician, a celebrated composer, and an extraordinary teacher. He held the position of distinguished professor at Lehman College, where he served from 1968 to 1988. I had the good fortune to be Ulysses Kay's student in the early 80s, and I'd like to share with you some of my experiences of him. In addition to one epiphany after another through studying composition, musical analysis, and polyphony with him, I and my fellow students experienced his gentle, patient humanity, which well served his giant, generous intellect and superb communication skills. My first experience of Kay's music was under the duress of having to decide who to study composition with, Ulysses Kay, whom I'd never heard of, or John Corigliano, whom everybody had heard of. My first inclination was to choose Corigliano, who had just been Oscar nominated for his film score, Altered States. His score of Altered States was brilliant, but it was alien and terrifying to me. So I started doing research on the alternative, Ulysses Kay. One of Kay's extraordinary pieces after another was in the ballpark of what I wanted my music to sound like, but I had a suspicion. It sounded a lot like Leonard Bernstein's work. The same magnificently lush, polyphonic, orchestral work married with beautiful melodic lines. Just to be sure, I compared dates and was surprised that Kay pieces that I was listening to were composed earlier than Bernstein works that I was familiar with. So I eagerly chose Kay, and it's no slight to Maestro Corigliano, but with my predisposition, Kay was my man. And to be clear about the comparison with Bernstein, they both share a similar musical landscape and do wonders within it. That's where I wanted to go as well. I later learned that Bernstein was the conductor who premiered Ulysses Kay's award-winning Suite for Orchestra. That speaks to me of recognition, respect, and possibly camaraderie between kindred spirits. The New Grove Dictionary of American Music offers that Kay's musical style is characterized by taut but warm melodies, complex polyphony, vibrant harmonic and orchestral coloring, and rhythmic diversity. The same could be said about Bernstein. And even when I was preparing for this talk, listening to Kay's Suite for Oboe and Piano that you're about to hear, I was struck by the naked first chord of the second movement played alone by the piano, and it immediately recalled to me the naked first chord introducing Simple Song from Bernstein's Mass. If you know that Bernstein masterpiece, listen for Kay's chord in the beginning of the second movement. Several of Kay's obituaries noted the contrast between the nearly universal praise his music had received and its relative obscurity. Quote, "He was as talented a musician as a Bernstein or a Copland," musical scholar Hildred Roach told the Washington Post. But, said Roach, he never got the publicity. Well, this afternoon, the Musicians Club of New York is taking its shot at making Ulysses Kay a little less obscure. I encourage you to look for some of Kay's celebrated large orchestral and operatic works. And in closing, I've had a little fun with Leonard Bernstein, but I believe he wouldn't mind if it gets you to give a closer ear to Ulysses Kay. And for the record, Kay's Suite for Oboe and Piano was composed in 1943, and Bernstein's Mass was composed in 1971. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. Now, our next speaker, Kevin Scott, is a man who also studied under Ulysses Kay at Lehman College and who helps maintain Kay's legacy today by tirelessly advocating on his behalf and by sometimes conducting, sometimes producing Kay's music. Now, I want to say a personal word about Kevin. Firstly, because he traveled all the way down here today from Lake George. And, you know, that's pretty far away, you know? And a lot of forts and things. And secondly, because I have known him and participated in music projects with him for around 15 years. And he and my composer husband, Douglas Townsend, hit it off the moment they met because Douglas also knew and admired Ulysses Kay, having himself taught at Lehman College for a few years during Kay's tenure there in the 70s, before your time. To further cement the Kevin Scott-Douglas Townsend relationship was the Bernard Herrmann connection. Kevin was, and surely still is, a huge fan of Bernard Herrmann's film music. Now, fate would have it that Douglas was also a Bernard Herrmann fan, albeit for different reasons. Douglas had been sort of taken under the wing of Bernard Herrmann when Douglas was a teenager here in Manhattan and when Herrmann was conducting the CBS Symphony Orchestra. This would have been around 1938 to 1940, at a time before Herrmann went out to Hollywood and became famous for his film music. Now, Herrmann did not formally teach Douglas. Douglas asked him to, and he said, "I don't do that, kid, you know, that's not what I want to do." But he let him sit in on rehearsals, orchestra rehearsals, whichever ones he was conducting. And so Douglas was very lucky to do this. He was just a teenager, really. And he loved to do this, and he loved to go to rehearsals and learn. You learned a lot about composition by listening to orchestra rehearsals. So Kevin Scott and my husband, Douglas Townsend, got on very well. Not to mention the fact that they were both passionate and knowledgeable about music and could dialogue together for hours. And you will see what I mean after you hear Kevin speak about Ulysses Kay, and then he will come back at the end of the program to speak about Dorothy Rudd Moore. Please welcome to the podium Kevin Scott.
Thank you, Jean, and good afternoon, everyone. My recollections of Ulysses Kay are quite, I don't know how to say it. I'll start from the very beginning. Well, first of all, I did know Ulysses back in the 1970s. I'm not as young as I look. My first encounter with Ulysses Kay was through his music when I was about maybe 15 or 16 years of age, reading John Tasker Howard's book, Our American Music, and reading about Ulysses Kay in a chapter dealing with composers of the 1940s and 50s. And I said, I wonder what this man's music sounds like. Well, I got the chance to hear it when, at the time, WNET ran a program called The Black Composer in America, featuring the Oakland Youth Orchestra. And they played Ulysses a short overture. The piece I should mention that Leonard Bernstein conducted, as apologies to Brian on this one, the piece that Leonard Bernstein premiered with the New York City Symphony in 1947. And that's the piece that won, as you see in the program, the George Gershwin Memorial Award. Anyway, that piece blew me away. And so they interviewed all the composers that were being featured on the program, including William Grant Still, Arthur Cunningham, and I forgot who else they interviewed. But when Ulysses said, "I teach at Lehman College in the Bronx," and I was living in Pelham Parkway in the Bronx at that time, says, "I must study with this man!" The next piece I encountered was Markings, a piece he wrote based on Doug Hammarskjöld's book. And it blew me away equally. Both are very different pieces, whereas Short Overture is firmly rooted in American neoclassicism. Markings is a tour de force for Ulysses in that he ventured into what we call atonal territory for this piece. It's a very dynamic piece. It's been played several times. It was recorded as part of the first in a series of volumes by Paul Freeman when Columbia Records issued its Black Composers Series. And so in 1974, I went to Lehman College after graduating high school, and I wanted to study with him. And I wanted to meet him. But I was told by the department secretary that he was on sabbatical for the fall semester. Nonetheless, one day, I was strolling the halls of Poe Center, which is where the music department was at Lehman at the time, and I saw this diminutive man coming out of his, but very scholarly looking man, coming out of his office, and it was him. And I ran up to him and I said, Professor K, my name is Kevin Scott, I'm a budding composer, and I can't wait to study with you. Gee, thanks. That was his response. And it was about a year later I got to study with him. So he looked in the class, there he is, and he said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear your pieces, and I'm going to start with Kevin Scott. Do you have anything? Not right now. Well, he caught me off guard. But nonetheless, I learned a great deal from him. When I brought one of my songs, a setting of a Dunbar text, he played through it, and he said to me, study the songs if you go both. Advice I honor to this very day. His music transcends different periods of time. He studied with no fewer than 3 great men in his life. He studied with Bernard Rogers and briefly with Howard Hanson when he was at Eastman School of Music in Rochester. And after his service in the Navy, he was one of the few students that studied with Paul Hindemith. So, and it was a privilege to study with Hindemith. So here's his music starting off first more or less from the sort of Eastman school, like his Sinfonietta and his oboe concerto and a piano quintet he wrote in the early 40s. The suite, by the way, comes from this period that you're going to hear, coming from 1943. But afterwards he studies with Hindemith, and he starts going towards a tighter neoclassical vein. Pieces like the Concerto for Orchestra and the suite for The Quiet One. The Quiet One was a documentary he wrote music for in 1948, and I had the privilege of making the world premiere recording of that suite with the Metropolitan Philharmonic Orchestra, a group I founded back in 1985. And we recorded 4 of his pieces, the Suite from the Quiet One, all those for flute and strings and percussion, Scherzi Musicali, and the 3 Blake songs. Needless to say, I should mention that inasmuch as Ulysses was a composer who came from, we should say, music royalty, his uncle was King Oliver, the noted jazz trumpeter, Ulysses also brought a lot of wealth to music in terms of what he had to say about music and what he had to say about life in music. 5 operas, a number of orchestral pieces, band pieces, choral pieces, oratorios, cantatas, vocal music, chamber music, 3 string quartets that deserve to be recorded to this very day. And music for television. He wrote music for the CBS television series, The 20th Century. And as I mentioned, The Quiet One, which is a great score. And yet, there are a lot of pieces of his that have only been played once, maybe twice. And that's it. One case in point is a piece he wrote called Once There Was a Man, that he wrote in 1970, and was premiered by the Detroit Symphony with William Warfield narrating and Sixten Ehrling conducting. And the next performance after that premiere in 1971 was mine in 1987 with the Metropolitan Philharmonic Orchestra and with Bob Sherman, may he rest in peace, as the narrator. And it hasn't been played since. There's several of his pieces that I'd love to see played, and one of them being a very fascinating piece that he wrote on a commission from the National Symphony called Western Paradise for the bicentennial of America. But this piece is, here it is, a piece about the American Revolution told from the British perspective, written by a black composer. And that is quite wild. I would like to see more of Yuli's music played, and I'm long overdue to record a second volume of his work, and I hope to do it one of these days as a conductor. But I think the best thing to say is that we're going to introduce our two artists, Lara and Dorothy, to perform Ulysses' Suite in B for oboe and piano. I think you will enjoy it. Thank you.
Now we move to the second composer on our program, Kermit Moore. And before Brian Hunter comes up here to speak about Kermit, I would like the audience to recall that Kermit Moore served on the board of directors of this club, the Musicians Club, for many years. And on a personal note, Kermit Moore was someone my husband knew for many years and admired for his many talents as cellist, conductor, and composer. I frequently heard him and Douglas on the phone discussing music and their musical projects. Douglas was always trying to get Kermit to play cello in Douglas's social networking concerts, but at that time Kermit was always too busy with conducting and composing. So let's hear more about Kermit Moore from Brian Hunter, who knew him personally. Brian Hunter.
So to his list, Kermit Moore was cellist, composer, conductor. He was also a beloved educator and concert curator. One of the renowned cellists of the 20th century, Kermit Moore became a champion of the works of 20th century composers. A 1969 New York Times review of his solo recital at Carnegie Recital Hall wrote, "Mr. Moore vaulted every technical hurdle of his formidable recital with disarming ease, and he instinctively found a precise stylistic voice for each composer. He is a virtuoso cellist, a sensitive musician, and something of a hero." That program, in addition to his own composition, included works by composers Ben Weber, Ian Hamilton, Roger Sessions, Beatrice Whitkin, and fellow African-American Hale Smith, all of whom were alive at the time. Born in 1929, succeeding as an African-American cellist was quite a rare feat in a largely white classical musical world, far more rare than it should have been. It took extraordinary and undeniable talent, and Kermit Moore used his multi-talents and platforms: composer, extraordinary conductor, founder of a couple of symphonies and an influential composer society, principal cellist of the Hartford Symphony, and cello soloist at an enviable list of major orchestras, distinguished professor at Hart School of Music, and a tireless board member, talent scout, and concert curator for the Musicians Club of New York. And he took on the role of championing artists, including the many overlooked minority artists that still permeate the classical world. He was the founder and conductor of the Classical Heritage Ensemble, a chamber orchestra which gave life to rarely performed classical works. He was also a co-founder and conductor of the Symphony of the New World, as well as a co-founder of the Society of Black Composers, along with his wife, Dorothy Redmore, and 3 others, which showcased African-American composers of classical, jazz, and film music. His international accomplishments and accolades include honors from European royalty, collaborations with ballet and opera companies, concertizing throughout the Far East and Africa, and with artists as divergent as Ruggiero Ricci, Dizzy Gillespie, and George Shirley. His involvement with the Musicians Club of New York goes back to at least 1987 and probably before that. I witnessed his support of Joe Conlon's efforts in the early 2000s and then continuing after Joe's passing, curating full, well-conceived concerts and being a strong advocate and supporter of the club's ideals. When Kermit died in November of 2013, I received a call from Dorothy, his wife of 49 years, and another of tonight's honorable dear composers. Her piece for solo cello dedicated to Kermit will conclude our concert today. She asked me to help her organize Kermit's memorial at St. Peter's Church on Lexington Avenue and 54th Street. We first met at her home, and her planning was laser-focused. She had an all-star lineup of African-American musicians, including a string quartet of the highest caliber, to play Kermit's music. As I recall, All I wound up doing was renting the space and printing the programs that Dorothy dictated to me. But I also brought with me Anthony Morse, of blessed memory, who eulogized his good friend with the proper erudition and knowledge that Kermit deserved at what turned out to be a glorious celebration. Kermit Moore's own compositions include works for symphony orchestra, solo works for cello, a timpani concerto, 2-string quartets, and a flute sonata. The latter we are going to hear this afternoon. Music for flute and piano in sonata form for 2 movements. Here's the description from the sheet music. A lush fantasia, followed by a lively allegro con spiritu. In difficulty, form, and sound, we might say that it closely resembles a French competition work. Hardly a surprise, given Moore's education at the Paris Conservatoire and his study with Nadia Boulanger and George Enesco. Ladies and gentlemen, flutist Mitzi Nonaka and pianist Laura Chechkoratova in Kermit Moore's Music for Flute and Piano.
So now I switch to my tablet. I had to write the script, a hosting script first, you know, because this all came sort of late, and I had to be sure that I got the hosting script done. So I did Douglas Townsend last. So now we arrive at our third composer, Douglas Townsend, the man who became my adored second husband in our proverbial sunset years. It is no exaggeration to say that when I met Douglas, my knowledge of composers and their world was very meager indeed. Most of what I knew derived from my childhood, where from a young age, at birthdays and holidays, I would receive these little white marble busts of composers. You remember those? And I was expected to place them on top of the piano, which sat in our living room, waiting for me to practice my scales. And I'm sure many of you experienced something similar. First, they give you a little bust of Bach. And then they give you Mozart, and then Beethoven. And you dutifully line them all up on the piano until one day you aren't given any more busts. Because your parents have suddenly realized that you aren't practicing enough. And that they will be humiliated at your next recital. And that in fact you will never practice enough. And that they are wasting their money on the piano. So thus it ends. No more piano lessons, no more composers. So living with a flesh and blood composer 24/7 filled me with a wonder and a kind of awe. How did they do it? How did they go from a piece of composition paper, a pencil and an eraser, to a completed symphonic work that could be expressively played by a huge orchestra and could entrance and emotionally move an entire audience? Where do you learn that? I mean, how do you learn? How do you begin? And especially if you are a 20th century American composer, without the benefit of centuries of national classical traditions such as exist in the European countries. So today I've decided to give you some insight into where American composers might begin. This piece by Douglas that we're going to play, his Piano Sonatina No. 1, was written by him when he was 22. And that was during World War II. And it was his very first public work. In other words, he has juvenilia, but that doesn't count, you know. This was his very first public work, and it was just for one instrument, the piano. And at this point, he'd been studying composition for only 7 years, which isn't much in composition. From the age of 15, at which time his mother had entered him into Manhattan's High School of Music and Art, where he had played trombone in the school orchestra, and discovered a whole room called a music library, which was full of music scores and parts, mostly from Europe. Now, when you think about the fact that Douglas ultimately composed for 75 years until his death at age 90, you realize what a neophyte he was at age 22, when he wrote this Piano Sonatina you're going to hear. By then, through private instruction here in New York from emigre European composers, he had learned European neoclassical structure and some 20th century harmony, but he had not yet studied orchestration with Aaron Copland or advanced principles with Otto Linnig. He had not developed his own voice, as he had by the time he wrote the second Piano Sonatina, which was 8 years later when he was 30. So in his first Piano Sonatina, you don't hear a Townsend voice, you hear the voice of his favorite composer, Prokofiev. And yet, this is the wonder of the intersection of music and talent. This first adult composition by Douglas was deemed to be promising enough by people who know these types of things to be premiered in Carnegie Hall by Ray Lev, a female concert pianist with an enthusiastic and large international following. The date of its premiere was in late 1945, right after World War II was declared over, and when Douglas was 24 years old. Not a bad way to start your career. Even today, almost 80 years after its composition, this work sounds remarkably fresh and with an engaging forward propulsion that creates excitement and erases time. So let's listen now to the first product of a young and gifted American composer as he embarks on a long and productive career in music with Douglas's Sonatina No. 1 for piano solo. And here to perform the work with appropriate youthful zest is the very talented and youthful pianist Eric Clark. and now, and I see Meredith Mayer is right here in the front row, and we're coming to her husband, composer William Mayer. And we have here with us today a real treasure, Bill's nonagenarian widow. She's in her mid-90s. Just a minute, I got more to say about her. Yeah. And she's a visual artist, and always has been. And she still lives here in Manhattan. I met Meredith well over a decade ago at a time when her composer husband, Bill, just happened to be rehabbing up in Riverdale at the same facility as my composer husband, Douglas. Now, neither Bill nor Douglas realized that the other one was in the facility. And by chance, we all bumped into each other at lunch one day in the dining room. And we all went, oh my God, look at that. The two composers recognized each other. A lively conversation ensued, and for the next 3 weeks, rehab turned into something like a vibrant college dorm. With the two octogenarian composers shuttling back and forth between each other's rooms, checking out each other's works in progress. And they both had their composition paper with them. That's really true. And also, William Mayer's son, Simon, also came to visit his father. And so that's where I met him. So Meredith, would you like to stand now and say a few words?
She stole my speech. But
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh.
I'm kidding.
Oh.
When Bill found out he was in one of the worst places he ever wanted to be, which is a nursing home, and he was getting better, and he found out there was somebody to talk to at the dinner table, and made the beginnings of a real friendship.
That's it.
And now we have the thanks to Jean for running a wonderful concert.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Meredith. And thank you for coming. And your son, thank you very, very much. You look great. Meredith is hard to keep up with, I'll tell you. She's in her mid-90s, you know. And am I not right about that?
She's 98.
98.
Oh, fabulous.
So when you think, well, we have Steve. We have there's the son Stephen, her son, and Phil's son, and he's a very talented pianist, and he's here today all the way from Denver, Colorado, where he teaches, and he has a few remarks he would like to make about his father.
Thank you all for coming today, and it's a pleasure to be back again. I recall recently 2 wonderful concerts here, and also I recall going back a little further in my life to about 1971. The founder of this organization, Olga Kusevitsky, used to come to the concerts. And it was quite something to see a piece of history like this. She was a Russian lady who was married to Serge Kusevitsky, the composer and the conductor of the Boston Symphony, who did a great many premieres of 20th century music. What I would say about the composition that we've chosen to do today is that a little bit like what Jean was talking about with regards to the last piece played, this being that composers have a period of time frequently where they're developing their voice, but they haven't fully done so, and therefore, in a way, you hear influences from composers that they love and whose music they're just kind of still not, they haven't gotten it out of their system completely yet. This is sort of the phase that my father was in, I think. I was 4 at the time he wrote the piece, so my memories are a little dim. But my suspicion is that the piece we're going to hear might have come on the heels of several passions that he had at the time. And when I hear this piece, it brought back a few memories. One of them was the composer Benjamin Britten from England, his famous Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, based on variations on a theme by Henry Purcell, the British composer, and different parts of the orchestra have different variations. He loved this piece and he introduced it to me, and I loved it too. And there is a section in the upcoming piece, the trumpet concert piece, that sounds so much like a riff in the last movement, the last variation of this, that I really wonder if he wasn't consciously or even unconsciously influenced by it. Another influence, I think, was the music of Bartók. He spoke all the time about Bartók. My earliest memories were that he loved Stravinsky and he loved Bartók. I think we can hear in this a little bit in terms of the echoes from the Concerto for the Orchestra by Bartók and also the music for percussion, strings, and celeste. And I think what you'll hear here is that my dad was not very far away yet from his own studies at the Mannes College of Music. And he would have been, let's see, well, it would have been when I was 4, so he would have been about 31 when he wrote this piece. And looking back on it now, a great many trumpet players have played it, and one very famous one before Pierce, who is quite well known now, was Gerard Schwartz, who got so known later on for conducting, and for conducting the mostly Mozart orchestra. Jerry did play this piece, and so did a number of others. And if you have the interest at some point, you might go to the website. It's a wonderful website my father has that you can reach by Googling his name. And you'll hear a performance of this same work in its original form, which was for string orchestra and trumpet. It's a live performance by the Little Orchestra Society and a trumpeter named Nagel. I think that this performance today will bring out another aspect of the piece, and you will hear more clearly the harmonic structure. And in listening to this, what I would keep in mind is that he was at this time in his life still very influenced by the polytonality of Stravinsky, the great rhythmic drive, and the kinds of rhythmic formations and kind of what we call now riffs that one can hear in the Bartók pieces that I mentioned. And a little bit of his own voice coming through already, not just in the energy, because this was something that was very characteristic of my father's music from the beginning and stayed that way through the end, but in the lyric qualities, in the contrasting points where a melodic line will appear, for instance, in the trumpet, and the piano will counter that with something very contrasting, both in terms of mood and also in terms of harmony. So let's enjoy this piece from 1957, the concert piece for trumpet and piano, performed today by Pierce Yamaoka and Yun Hao.
And now we come to the last and youngest of the 5 composers on the program today, Dorothy Rudd Moore. And she was the beloved and devoted wife of Kermit Moore, the one we heard earlier. And he predeceased her by about a decade. And this piece for solo cello that we are performing today was written by Dorothy when she was only around age 24. And she wrote it as a wedding gift for Kermit. Yeah, and it's whom she had met and been smitten with shortly after she moved from Delaware to New York City. I know this from a late interview she gave to Bruce Duffy, wherein she also stated that she was channeling Bach's cello suites, when she composed this youthful work. So, you know, she was like Douglas, they were both young. So he channeled Prokofiev, so she channeled Bach. And this is where you start, right? Dorothy and Kermit had no children to carry on their legacies or speak on their behalf. But we are very fortunate to have Kevin Scott here to do so. Okay, Kevin is back now to speak about Dorothy Rudd Moore.
And here I am again. Well, before I go into Dorothy Rudd Moore, I'd like to mention a big thank you to Jean Townsend, to the Musicians Club of New York, and to all of the composers who, and all the speakers who have spoken this afternoon, and all of the composers here, and all of the 5 composers, I've known all of them. I knew every one of them. Bill Mayer, through Ellie Sigmeister, wonderful gentleman, fine composer. And as I mentioned, studying with you, Ulysses Kay, was one of the greatest treasures of my life. And Douglas Townsend was a wonderful gentleman as well. Working with him on his pieces, I conducted at SUNY Orange in Middletown many years ago. And now we come to Kermit and Dorothy Rudd Moore. I want to mention a couple of things about Kermit before I go into Dorothy. Kermit was a wonderful gentleman himself, fine musician, one of the finest musicians I've ever met, a great composer, and you know, his music is terrific. You heard from his flute piece earlier, and I know his piece from, one of his first pieces I heard was a piece called Many Thousand Gone, which he wrote for chorus, percussion, and string orchestra. Wonderful piece. Gave me the score, and one of these days I have to do it. In fact, I might wind up, you know something? I might wind up doing that on my next Juneteenth concert in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's a good idea. Okay, that's a good idea. I should do that. I think we're gonna have a ball with that piece. Anyhow, with Dorothy Rudd Moore. Now, you know, it's amazing how we all know composers, and composers know each other in many ways, shape, and form. And several composers here in the room that came out this afternoon to hear me speak and hear this music, this wonderful music. And I want to mention a good shout out to 3 of them right now, is Leonard Lerman, Howard Fox, and Mark Grant. Great guys, all 3 of them. And Dorothy Rudd Moore. The first time I met Dorothy was sometime back, I would say in the late 80s, rather briefly. But it wasn't until 1992 that I got to know Dorothy. I was a finalist in the Unisys African American Composers Forum and Symposium with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And I was one of 4 composers that was a finalist for that program. I was one, Wendell Logan, Regina Harris Bayaki. Oh yes, and a young fella who has gone on to greatness now in motion pictures named Michael Abels, who scored a lot of Jordan Peele's movies. He was very young back then. And indeed, it was, you know, we thought that Michael was going to win the competition for his piece, Global Warming. And my piece was the Preludium and Eternium from Ben-Hur. And Dorothy happened to be one of the adjudicators for that year on the Detroit Symphony Symposium. Well, lo and behold, I was shocked when I won. And we all thought, and Dorothy said to me, I can't tell you what happened, but it was very close. He was good about that. But Dorothy was more than just a composer. She was, I don't know how to say this, but she was a fashion plate like no tomorrow. She always came in dressed to the nines. Even when she was casual, she was always dressed to the nines, immaculate dresser. It's as if she was going to either a business meeting or a church social. She was beautifully dressed all the time. But her music was equally beautiful, equally pungent and powerful, equally melodic and moving. And if you ever heard from the Dark Tower, her song cycle, it's one of the most amazing pieces she ever composed. It's a great piece, setting, I think, poets from Dunbar to County Cullen, I forgot who else. But she had a gift for writing such gorgeous melodies, and yet, when she wanted to get a little spicy and pungent with the dissonances, she knew when to use them, how to use them, and where to use them. She just didn't use it for its own sake, she used it because there was a purpose and a meaning behind it. She also wrote great melodies because there was a meaning behind it too. Now, I'm going to close with Darren Atkins, who's a wonderful cellist, will perform this suite. And I gotta say, what Jean said about, composers being young and taking role models, having written music myself, I always looked at all my role models as a kid and, I was all over the map and everything, but you have to find your voice sooner or later. And it's something that I find today with two sets of young composers. On the one hand, there's a new generation of young composers who want to return to the past and forsake what has happened from the time of Debussy to the present. They would rather go back and try to write Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. And yet, I ask myself, but do you want to recreate it, or do you want to use this as a springboard to find your own voice? And I'm finding a lot of them don't want to do that. They just want to recreate the past. But then again, you also have composers who want to recreate the present, or rather the recent present, I should say, and yet, but don't you want to move forward and find something else that's new and still try to find your voice? Well, Dorothy did find her voice in many ways. You can hear influences, yes, we all have our influences in our music, but we also have something else, personality behind all our music. And Dorothy's music, when it's in the person, it's in the music, and in Dorothy's music it is. Final thing I'm going to close, there's one thing that both Ulysses Kay and Dorothy Wedmore have in common. They both wrote an opera on Frederick Douglass. Now, both operas are grand operas. Both have been done in recent years by Kevin Maynard's group Trilogy in Newark, New Jersey. And I spoke to Dorothy about the opera, and I asked her, are you familiar with Ulysses' opera? And she said, yes, we're great friends, and but Ulysses' opera is different from mine. I covered the younger Frederick Douglass in mine, and he covered the older Frederick Douglass. And indeed, it would be nice if the Metropolitan Opera, which has recently started to do black composers, Terence Blanchard, now Anthony Davis, should take a look at these two operas of these two titans. Maybe mount them in one season would be cool to see the differences. Because it would be great to hear this kind of opera played and this kind of opera mounted. And for the fervor record, Dorothy's opera, when it was premiered by Opera Ebony, was cut. So it would be great to hear an uncut version of her Frederick Douglass. And of course, Ulysses' Frederick Douglass is being done by the Boston Modern Opera project. I think it's being recorded next year. But as I said, Metropolitan Opera, where are you? Come and get these pieces. Now for Darren, I should say, and Dorothy.